Kia rukuhia e tātou ngā kōrero a papa Rereata Makiha, raua ko tāku ta Phillips, mo te kaupapa o te rā a rā ko te wai. Ka wānanga hia o nā paringa o nā timunga, o nā rerenga hei tā te tirohanga Maori. Ka tūhuratia hoki e ngā kaikōrero ngā tohu, e hāngai ana ki tēnei kaupeka o te tau, me te tuaritanga o enei mohiotanga ki o tātou whānau, hapori hoki. Hei, taupoki ake ka kōrero tianga wawata e tūmana ko tiana, mo te anamata, mo te wahi ki te wai. This panel brings together Papa Rereata Makiha and Dr. Phillips in a discussion about wai. This panel kōrero reflects on traditional concepts about wai, the essence of life that aids our movement through this world, looking into local stories about wai and the obligations that come with our connection to wai. Our kaikōrero will also share these learnings with our whānau and explore the tohu associated with this kaupeka, what they mean and how those are disseminated. Finally, we discuss what our kaikōrero hope to see in the future when it comes to our relationship with wai. Hei, whakamaharatanga ke te iwi as we move through this kōrero. Should any pātai or comments arise in response to what's being said, please remember to write them in the patopaki or chat, tēnā koe te whae e pānia i tō kupu hou, and we will endeavour to field those to our kaikōrero as we move through. So without further ado, e ngā rangatira, tēnā whakamohio mai, a ko wai kōrua, no hea kōrua. Te rā kaikōrero kia kōrua. Rawa mohio me kia koe tuatai papa.
Kia ora. Tēnā tātou. Tēnā koutou e ko tahuri mai ta wharongo e nei kawenga kōrero i te ata nei me te miharo katoa rā ki te kaupapa kei mua i a tātou. Kone tuatahi ake ko tēnei he uri no roto mai o hokianga whakapaukarakia me tahi hono ngā atu hoki ki roto te arawa waka. Nā reira tēnā koutou. Me mea ko tīmata ia e nei e kawiti, te tuku i ngā kōrero. Koina mōku ake rā ngā mea i akona mai nei kia mātou no roto mai te whare wānanga o hokianga i te wā ia mohi waitai mā huru titore mā te pene tana mā, haka haere ana wānanga ana i roto o manaia. Ka taka atu ki roto o waimā, ki roto kaikohekohe, huri atu rā ki tangi te roria, e rā wāhi nā he kōrero tuku iho o reira, te tahi e pēnei ana mo te tahi o ngā kōrero mo tēnei mea mo te wai, e mea na e hara te wai no konei. Ngari te wā te heke ngā mai i ngā pō nui, ngā pō roa, he pō katoa te ao hei tā rātou. He pō, he wai katoa. Nā no mua no atu tēnei ia papa tuanuku rāua ko ranginui. Ko te whakapapa hia anau te tiki atu tuatahi, ko tēnei ko te moenga o tangotango kia wainui. Tōna ingoa ko wainui, engari ko tōna kāinga i noho mai a wainui ki te ātea o te rangi. Nā ka tapaina tōna ingoa ko wainui ātea. Nā ka moe a tangotango ka moe a wainui ātea. Nā ka puta mai ko moana nui, moana roa, moana hakere, moana pōtango, moana tū i te repo, me moana tū i te wao. Nā ka tiki nātu i tēnei wā, ngā kōrero mō tērā o ngā tūpuna a moana tū i te repo. Tērā wā tātou nei te wai o patu kino hia nei, te hunga kekeri whenua, kekeri awa, kia rere atu tōna kaha tōna mana ki roto te tangaroa whakamautai, mate katoana a moana tū i te repo. Te kōrero i waiho hia mai e wa tātou nei mātua, ari me hoki anō ki ngā pūrākau, hei whakamāra mai i te kōrero mo moana tū i te repo. Ko e hoki te mea i noho hei kai, kai wawao, wainga nui te pakanga, wainga nui i a tāne raua ko Tangaroa. Ne te pakanga i te pairangi, te wehenga o ngā mātua, ne a rangi rau ko papa, ka pakanga ngā tama. Nā te tahi o ua pakanga, wainga nui a tāne, raua ko Tangaroa. Te mea ka kainga e tāne, e tahi o ngā tamariki o Tangaroa. Ka rika rika Tangaroa. Ka mei ngātu e Tangaroa kia tāne mua ke tunu atu ko te tuku i e wana wai. Ka haere ki te kekeri i te whenua. Kia ngahoro mai ngā uri a tāne. Kia taka mai ki roto te wai toromi ai. Ko roa tērā pakanga e haere ana. So ka noho a moana tu i te repo. Hei kai wawao pē, wainga nui tērā pakanga o ngā tamanei. Ko tana mahi hei hopu ake i ngā wai e pātere mai ana, puritia ki roto i te repo. Ngā paru ka kekeria mai e ngā wai nei, roto i ngā wai puke ka puritia e moana tu i te repo ki roto i ngā repo. Kia kaua e tere atu ki roto i ngā awa, kia kaua e tere atu ki te moana. Ko tana, te ratana mahi, he noho hei kaitaka wainga nui ngā te pakanga o ngā tamara, tāne rau ko Tangaroa. Te wao te maroke, ka tai mai te pēki maroke, ka pēhia ngā repo nei. Ko tana mahi ka haere ki te whakamākūkū i ngā awa, i te moana ka tuku ngā wai kia rere, kia kaua e maroke ngā awa. Iaia nei nā ko kite a tātou te nui ngā wa tātou nei repo, kua mate. Neke atu te iwa te kaumārima ōrau o ngā repo o te whenua nei, ko patua, ko mate. Tāku e tiro ake iaia nei, ka hore he hokinga mai, o tērā. Tā te mea kua tātou awa e kore e ora, mea hore kau a moana tu i te repo. We tahi o a mātou nei mahi kūware, ko te wāhi nei ka kekeria nei, wa tātou nei waikeri, ke hāngai tunu, kia kaua e piko. E pai tunu i tēnei te noho roto i te reo, e whiti atu rānei ki roto i te reo o te reo pihi ke te rā.
Koe papa, mena he whakamāramatanga kei te reo Pākehā pai mutunga engari.
Pai.
Karawhiua.
Te reo mellow puff. E reo mellow puff hei tā hare. Reo mellow puff. Mene te reo mellow puff. So the beginnings of water from kōrero from our tūpuna was e hara no kone. So it's not from here, but from te āte o te rangi. And it goes back he pō katoa te ao, he wai katoa. So everything was in darkness, everything was water. So this was before land. Te mea muhia nei tātou papatu anu no mua ke. And it goes back to the union of tangotango and wainui ātea. From there we get the whakapapa of all the tūpuna of the oceans, moana nui, moana roa, moana hakere, moana pōtango, moana tui te wao, and moana tui te repo, moana tui te wao. So moana tui te wao is our inland lakes, and moana tui te repo that I'm talking about here is our swamplands. And moana tui te repo was given the job of being the peacemaker between that pakanga between Tāne and Tangaroa. When Tāne ate some of Tangaroa's children, you know, the sort of things we do now, haere te kai ngā kai moana, ngā iko te moana, I timata mai reira. Ka pukuriri a Tangaroa. So in his anger, he said to Tāne that he's going to send up all his water and all the waters and going to gouge out the earth now and going to get Tangaroa's children and drag them and drown them in the sea. So that's our story of erosion there. And it's a battle between atua there. And so when we start going around and starting fixing up the areas that are eroding and all the haka tika mai ngā awa, our old people will say, kia mahara koutou, pakangana koutou ki ngā atua, that you're fighting atua. And there's only one winner in a fight like that there. So te tahi o ngā mea, the important thing about moana tui te repo was She was the peacemaker between that pakanga. So she would grab all the excess water and the flooding and that came down from all that way that Tangaroa was sending up to erode Papa Tuanuku and drag Tāne's children and drown them in the sea. That te rate mahi a te repu, mona tui te repu. And she would capture all that excess water and hold them in the swamplands so that they won't go out into the waterways. And then in the periods of drought, and she'll be like a wet sponge neck up here, and then she'll rehydrate all the awa and all the rivers there. And without those swamplands, over 95% of our swamplands, ko patua, they've been killed, drained. 95%. Ko mate ke a mona tui te repu. Without the help of those swamplands, there is no way at all that we can actually get our rivers back to where they should be. E kaimanga ika wera mumu mea. So tērā te kōrero tuku iho ngā mātua, mo tēnā mea mo tērā taha o te wai. Te tahi atu o ngā kōrero mo te wai, ko te wai tote e tīmata mai ana te tihi o ngā maunga. So when I see a lot of these environmentalists going, especially out in the Hauraki Gulf, and in all our moana, ka haere ki te tiro fixing up the ocean, you actually got to fix up the land first there. Te mea tuatai. E hoki anu ki te haka toi ngā rākau tika. So, mea nei te tahi kōrero tuku iho mai I hokianga, tapu wai manea, te ika I karangatia te tai o hokianga. E kui mai kara mā patua I te tere I uta, te tere I tai, kei ketu e te kore. Tēnā hoki rātō whakatina, he kore pēr no te ngongo kino, tane kino, kui kino. Ko rimu haere kauwai, ko tōtara haere kauwai, ko pukatea haere kauwai, ko koroi haere kauwai, titi e tatai. Ko wera rākau, ko te kāuru wera. So they are the upper canopy of the ngahere at the time of the matiti kura phase of summer, the kaupeka tuatahi o te raumati. So in our whakapapa kōrero tuku iho, we have 7, whitu ngā kaupeka o te raumati, 7 phases of summer. Timata mai ana I te matiti kura, matiti hana, matiti muramura, matiti kaiwai, matiti raurehu, matiti rau tapata, matiti rau angina. And the further south you go, I think from Maniapoto down, I'm guessing, taupo ki te tonga south there, you add another matiti in there. There, waruratu, waratu. Mātua te kāingane e whitu noiho. So those are the 7 kaupeka o te raumati. And I'll talk about those first. So under each one of those kaupeka, there are canopies that exist there. In the matiti kura, so you got timata mai ana with the tōtara, koroi, rimu kahikatea, the upper canopies ka taka mai ki ngā kauru oraro, all the way down to your moss and lichen I te whenua there. And all of them have a purpose for that. Tērā wā o te tau, te matiti kura, to feed the manu, feed the ika, te whāngai te ngahere. And then each one of those matiti phases, ka taka koe ki te matiti hana, is the longest phase of our summer. Ne, te roanga tērā te kaupeka o te raumati. E toru marama pēr e haere ana a matiti, whā marama e tahi tāma o te matiti hana. And in that phase, that's where most of the activity is in the taiao. And there are different flowering trees, the kahu, the upper canopy, the middle canopy, the lower canopy, and the harore canopy below. Ka rereke, e whāngai ana I ngā karare, so it provides kai for that part of the summer. Ne? And then all these phases, ne, ka tai mai ki te muramura, te wā e muramura mai te pū, te kaua me te rāta, there's the 3rd phase of summer, ne, te matiti muramura. And each one of these phases, they have canopies that grow na mai te whenua, tainoa ki te kauro, te ngahere. And these canopies change during these matiti phases. So when we are planting and restoring place, we don't plant them willy-nilly just because he native te mea nei. Hakatoa ngia ki te taho ngā awa he native pai. And in haere koe te titiro, if you have a good look at what they're doing, hey, pai tērā mea te haere hakatoa rāko, hey, I got no issues about that. But hey, how do you feed these manu and these ngata and these arara and these ika for the rest of the tau, eh? And that's where our planting, our restoration, mahi, he ke ana, ne? That we need to go back ro te ngā kōrero tupu I hoa tātene mātua tupuna to replant according to those e te raumati, matiti o te raumati, matiti kura, matiti hana, matiti muramura, matiti kaiwai, matiti raurehu, matiti rau tapata, which we're just going into rau tapata iaia nei. Ne me te matiti rau angina. And then we go into the 6 phases of winter. Ka pū mai te hau o te ninihi, about middle of May, ka pū mai te hau o te ninihi. Ka taka atu tātu ki te wero e te ninihi, wero e te kōkota, wero e te whakatakapunga rehu, takurua uru, takurua angana, takurua aio. So there are 6 kaupeka o te hotoke that you also have to have canopies all the way through the ngahere to provide kai for the manu and the ngāngara and the tangata all the way through those kaupeka. Ne? So what's the how tēnei mai te haere te hakatoa kahi katoa, ne ki te taho ngā awa. I don't know any fish that feeds on kahi katoa. Okay. Well, not yet, unless they're creating one at ora I te kai ngā rau o te kahi katoa. He mānuka hoki ki wetahi, ne, ngai kia mātua te kai ngane ko te kahi katoa. He rere ke te mānuka kia mātua I konei, ne. He tū ngā tapatahi te mānuka, ne, ka taia, te rahi, tū tapatahi ngai te kahi katoa, muia katoa te whenua, ka hore he mea e tupu I raro, ne. And it kills everything underneath it. Yeah, but that's what we're planting along our waterways. And I don't know how that feeds the tuna and the fish and all the kokopu that are in those awa. Te rā taku whakahe ki ngā mahi neana. Te hoki anō ki te kōrero o tātene mātua tūpuna, so align it with these kaupeka o te tau, and ngā tohu o te ngahere, e tupu mai ai we rā kai nei, so that we align it properly with what's required to keep that taiao, that wa tātene awa, keep them alive. Now, last quarter, just a little bit, kei roa hoki, kei ho hā katoa, ngā tāngata e hakarongo mai ana. And rote wa tātou nei awa. So along those, we got the rimu, the tōtara, the kahikatea, te hua te kahikatea, te koroi, me te pukatea, e rā momo kākano, ka takataka mai ki roto te ngā awa, ne ka tere atu ki te kurutai, ki te whāngai ngā ika, ka haere mai I ka tangaro, ka haere mai ki te kurutai. Nā tērā te pakanga mutunga, wainga nui a tāne rau ko tangaro. So that kurutai, where the salt water, where the fresh water meets the salt water, is the final battleground between tāne and tangaro. Because that's where tangaro sends his whānau in to eat all the insects and all the berries that coming from te wao nui a tāne, ka tere mai ngā awa, ka tai ki te kurutai, ka haere mai ngā ika ki te kai. So if you're wanting to test the health of a awa, you go to the kurutai. Ne? Me he mea ka haere mai ana ngā ika ki te kurutai ki te kai, ora ana te rā awa. So you go and find the next one where there's no ika coming in. Ka mo hio koe mate ana te rā awa. So you go and replant them, not with manuka, not only with tikauka, but to those matiti, to fill all those matiti phases, the 7 matiti kaupeka o te raumati, and those 6 kaupeka o te hotoke. And when you get those plantings right, and those combinations right, nā kōra mai te taiao. Wa wera oku nei whakaaro. Runga rai ngā kōrero tuku I hoa rātou mā. Me pēra ke te titio, me pēra ke ta tātou nei hoki anō ki ngā kōrero tuku I ho, hei arataki I a tātou. Ta te mea mōkuake, e he katoa ngā mahi ngā nei e nei rā. Wa e hara I te he rawa e te mea e hakatō rākau ana rātou ne. They're awesome getting them out there, tamariki out there planting, But I think we need to rethink what we are planting there, and why are we planting them, and how is it going to feed our taiao through those 7 kaupeka o te raumati, or 8 if you're further south, so you go to noho mai ana ki te tonga, well, you got more work because you got 8 kaupeka o te raumati, and the 6 kaupeka o te hotoke, ne, where you have to feed the taiao. Ngā manu, ngā kararehe, ngā tanga, mea katoa, ngā ika o te moana. And I think that if there's a message we need to get out, mo roto tēnei mea mo te kōrero mo te wai, he ko tērā, ne, me hoki anō ki ngā tohu kōrero tuku I hoa tātou nei mātua. So we're getting to expect to feed the taiao. No? And if I got 5 more minutes, can I jump over on the other side, to the other side of the kōrero mo te wai? And this is that puna wai. The mātamu of all our wai is the puna wai. Ne ka heke mai konei ko pipi, rawa ko wawai, the puna wai and the deep water aquifer, the most tapu of all our wai. And people are draining it. Yeah. E ngote hiana, hei mo te hakamāku i warata nei avocado orchards, wera momo mea ne. He ana tēnā. Tā te mea, if you suck those aquifers dry, wa ea te paka ngā tangaro. Ko tangaro ka hau mai. Nā te mea, ko pipi a wawai, ta ko taitua rau ko taiaro, ngā mea wai e rere ana runga te whenua, taitua taiaro, ngari ko hāmui mui, raua ko ue papatangaro. So those are the freshwater aquifers that are under the sea. Ne. And te rā te kuhunga mai o tangaro. So ina ngote hea, ka maroke, hāmui mui raua ko ue papatangaro, if we drain those, tangaro comes in there. He hatana mahi, he haka ea i te tana pakanga kia tāne, te pairanga. So that's tērā te kōrero tiro wa tāte nei mātua mo tēnā ne. Tērā te tahi atu o ngā kaupeka o ngā kōrero tupu iho mo tēnei mea mo te wai ko te puna wai ne. A pipi a wawai, a taitua rau ko taiaro, a hāmui rau ko ua papatangaro. Ko era ngā wai Maori kei roto, kei raro te moana, pihi pupu wake ana i te moana. Nā kei reira te raru ki te ngote e tātou ngā wai oroto te whenua ne. Ka haere mai a tangaro. Mō kua kera, hara hau te scientist, ngare, rongo anau ngā kōrero haka mārama tuku iho a tātou mātua, tia kina ngā wai, te rā te take. Kia kau hau mai a tangaroa ki te haka raru i te whenua. Ka nui pē tēnei mo tēnei wane, he mea pahu noi o kei roa rawa tēnei pahu ka hoha ngā tangata.
Ka hore rawa atu, ono mihi ana nei. Koe, e tika ana tai, me hoki atu ki ngā kōrero tuku nā reira, e tika ana kia hora e nei kōrero i tātana hei tīmatanga kōrero matata e te pāpana reira, tēnā koe. And just like, you can see, it's everything these days is all silent. Nah, we've got to fix the water. E hara ko te wai anahe, e anake ko te whānuitanga tunu o te taiao. It's everything. It links in with everything. And I'm just curious, Chanel, e te tuahine, you know, ia koe whakarongo nā as you're listening to Papa's kōrero. Have you got any whakaaro that come up to around, in your experience of working with wai and its impacts on you and the work that you do? Yeah, ka tuku atu pēr e tehi koro kia koe.
Tēnā koe kawiti. Ai, nere te mihi e Pāpa Rereata mō tō kōrero a tāhu rau atu. Ko wai au, ko mō te tauti maunga, ko taikirau te awa, ko ngā toki mata whaurua te waka, ko ngā hui te iwi, ko ngā tihine te hapu. No mō te taumata waia o Tiria hau, ko Chanel Phillips tōku ingoa. No reira tēnā koutou katoa. Yeah, heck, that was a beautiful kōrero, one to follow for sure. And I sort of joked with Dario at the beginning when he put the tono out to come on this panel, and I sort of said yes without really knowing who was on it. Then I found out who was on it, and I sent him a quick message just sort of saying, you know, are you sure you want me on here? You know, like it's fine, it's a way out, you know, you don't need to have me on this panel. And Dario came back and he said, no, tuahine, that'll be awesome, beautiful to get different perspectives. And my message back to him was, you'll get 2 different perspectives, te kauwairunga and te kauwairaro, and you can only guess which one I'll be presenting today. And so it was just beautiful to hear your kōrero this morning, Matua Rereata. And I think in my sort of world and my upbringing, my kōrero really to share is around my experience coming through university particularly, and my aronga of Ngāti Hine. And for me as a tauira Maori coming through, I did about 10 years of study. And for me, that was really how I actually reconnected back with my whakapapa, with my whānau, and with my aronga o Ngāti Hine. was through those rangahau, the research alongside my communities. And that's probably where I get to why, to water. I'll quickly just share my screen just so I can have a quick kōrero. If I stop that one. Just because I wanted to share a couple of pictures with everyone. And so in many ways, when we talk about why and Matua Rereata's kōrero about where why comes from, and for me coming through, it was my really about ko wai no wai, ko wai nā wai, who are we in terms of water and from where our waters descend. And if I bring it back to the context of Toi Tangata, this actually was my first beginning as a tauira, as a student coming through university, was with the kaupapa of Toi Tangata. It was the first time I presented research. It was sort of the first entry point into te ao Maori for me. And it was a kind of a beautiful reminder that these would sort of pop up this would have been about 7 years ago now, coming to our first Toi Tangata as students and being able to present on our work. And I just wanted to mihi to Leonie and Kelly, who at the time invited students to this kaupapa and giving us the opportunity to share our whakaro. And I remember thinking back as a student, like, what knowledge do we have to share? You know, we're just pepe, we're just the little babies here. I still feel that way now, especially now sitting on this panel alongside Matua Rereata, you know, kind of trying to understand what can we contribute. And for me, it was really about how I interpreted the tauparapara for this kaupapa around the fruits and the hua. For me, it was thinking about what were those hua as a tauira. And I know there'll be quite a few students on this kaupapa, on this hui ato. And so I thought that's probably what I could speak to a wee bit, as well as what were those hua for me as a tauira. You know, I was brought up on the marae in Ngāti Here, Motatau, Matawai, o Tiria, but my whānau, we moved away when I was about 13. And so that connection changed for me. And it wasn't until later in life, coming through university, that I really then wanted to reconnect with home. And it was through my rangahau where I was able to do that and unpack more of who I am and where I come from in terms of water. And so these were some of the images that really resonated and reflected my hua, those people and those places and those practices through why that I was able to reconnect with who I am and the mahi of importance and of importance to me and what I'm passionate about. And so my Auntie Rangi Davis here at Otiria Marae, and I spoke about Auntie Rangi and the kōrero she shared with me about the puna wai, the mātā puna, a couple of years ago at the hui ato in Munguru. And I've used this image here, me and my siblings at Pātawa Beach. I've used that many times in many kōrero. It's what I used to present at my very first Toi Tangata as a student. This picture here of Papa Mike, Dr. Mike Paki, no Ngāti Apa, Ngā Wairiki ia. And Papa Mike was one of the kaumātua that really helped support me throughout my PhD research. And it was him that really encouraged me to find my voice in my research. And that's really that key hua that I wanted to share with many tauira who are on the Zoom today, is finding your voice in your mahi, in your research. And if you didn't have the opportunity to grow up home, to be able to sit with your kaumātua and kuia, you know, it's never too late. And that was very much my own journey, was having that time with my kaumātua and kuia, to sit with them and to learn from them. And Māori Marsden, one of our Ngāpuhi scholars, philosophers, he was one of the key texts that I really used in my rangahau and my research. And one of the kōrero that comes from his book, The Woven Universe, talked about the world of symbol. And there's a little wee quote there that people can read, but really the way I thought about it was I'm a visual learner. I love to draw. I'm not good at drawing, but I love to draw, and it helps me make sense of what I'm reading, what kōrero is being shared with me. And I would sort of make my own brainstorms and my own mind maps. And so that very much helped guide me throughout my university research, and then even now into being an academic down at the university in Dunedin now. And so what I wanted to share was a really brief kōrero about how the world of symbol really supported me in finding my voice and bringing it through into my research. And so what happened was with my PhD research, which was all around looking at Māori water safety. So I've talked about this a few times, but in our Wai, we have a high Māori drowning rate. And the last summer we've just had, it was the worst we've ever had. So about 31% of Māori drowning last year, despite only making up about 16% of our population. And at the time, really trying to understand why is it that Māori have this high drowning rate, despite the strong cultural, spiritual connection that we have to Wai. Have we got a changed relationship, a changed connection? How might we strengthen that to ensure the safety of our people in and around the water? But then what Matua Rereata was talking about, our state of Wai, is that actually impacting on our drowning statistics as well, and the change in being able to access some of those Wai. And so those are some of the questions I was really interested in understanding. But for me, the kind of world of symbol was depicted in some of these images here. And when I was doing my research and trying to make my voice come through stronger, I just started drawing. And these were some of the images that came up for me. And the main idea for me was about this life cycle of the Tuna, of our longfin eel, a kaitiaki, a taonga, to Ngā Tirimi. And I really started to try to understand how the journey that the Tuna goes from being an egg out at sea, coming through the currents, drifting to the shores of Aotearoa, where the baby alvas then find their way up through into the fresh water, or through the estuaries into the fresh water, and back up to the creeks and the swamps that the parents came from, and then returning back again to die at sea. And that kind of life cycle of the Tuna was the same way that I thought about my research, was how is it that we can understand where our Wai starts from the maunga, from our mountains, all the way up to sea, and then coming back again. And so this image here is just some of the pictures that I drew for my mahi. And it really spoke about how the Tuna comes to know who it is and where it comes from, in the same way that we as people do. And then in the same way, we as tauira, who are many times struggling with who we are and where we come from, and how we can make sense of the research. And so it was really about going home for me. And so I drew on our tauparapara of Hine Amaru to really help me find my voice, to help me find my place in the research. And these images really helped to reflect the kōrero that came from that tauparapara. Ka papa te whatitiru, ka hikohiko te uira, ka hukura ki te rangi, hi aiksu ka riri, ka rongo mai ka he, ko munguru, ko ngangana, ko aparangi. Ko te titi o te rua, ko te tau whakawahine, ko te tau horo, ko te motu o te rere, ko te ao ngā rangatira, taumarere, here i te rere, tiria te pone ki te riki, ki te tanariki, e tu atu nei ngā tirine poke rau, tihei wa mauri ora. And for me, that tauparapara was really about this journey that the Tuna, in many ways ourselves, we journey coming into knowing better who we are and where we come from in terms of Wai. And it references our chiefly rivers, the Taumarere, the Otiria stream, which I grew up swimming in. And it spoke about te puna ki te riki, the puna that sits above our waterfall, where the baby alvas would get to their sort of their safe haven, if you will. but only by working together with a tangariki able to actually get over that waterfall, this big, massive challenge and adversity to them. Only by working together could they achieve that, could they then find safety and nurturing in this puna. And so in many ways, for me, my research was a way to reconnect with my whakapapa through water. And I probably didn't realize that, and I'm still sort of realizing it as time goes on, how those different layers of relationships, connections with people, kōrero stories, coming back to trying to understand some of our pūrākau, mō tia karakia, and finding those connections within them. And so that's where I very much was and still am, and that in that sort of early stages of reconnecting. And these images really helped me to share my voice as Ngāti Hine, to show that even a kaupapa like water safety still fundamentally for Māori comes back to our identity, who we are and where we come from in terms of why. And if we're not looking after the why, then we're not looking after ourselves, and vice versa. And so encouraging people to strengthen their connections to who they are and where they come from. And so that's very much part of my passion is, while it is water safety, it's still about how do we strengthen and build connected communities to the why, in order to have better outcomes for the why we're entering into, but also so that our people can thrive in those spaces as well. So that was just a little bit of the kōrero that I wanted to share. I don't actually know if that answered your question, Kawati, but I think it's those different layers of, you know, you can have the beautiful mātanga, tohunga, the kōrero from Matua Rereata, and then as a tauira, as a student, and I love to learn, and I love knowledge, and I do love reading. And so trying to draw on some of that kōrero and make sense of it in our own sort of unique way as well. So yeah, that was just, I'll leave it at that for now. Tēnā kōrero.
Tāhua tuahine, a tāhua. Tātou, ngā tauira e noho tangariki nei, ei. Ki ngā rekereke o a tātou tupuna, me ngā kōrero tuku iho, is beautiful. And I think it really reminds me of that, you know, te rā kōrero ko au, ko koe, ko au, e me mahara tātou, we are, there's no distinction, there's no wehenga, between us and taiao and our wai. So if there's dis-ease in the wai, there's dis-ease on the land, there's dis-ease in the iwi. And I suppose that brings us back to, you know, that interconnection between tangata and wai. Yeah, I mean, hei tīmatanga nahi anō tēnei panel. Our kōrero is going to be organic, so just jump in whenever. If there's any kōrero, whakaaro that come up, but hei tīmatanga ke, you both of you mentioned kōrero aiwi, you know, aua pūrākau, kōrero tuku iho ko oti ke koe, e te papa, e tahi o ira kōrero ko oti ke hoki koe, e te tuahine. What are some of those? Hea e tahi o ira kōrero aiwi, e mohiotia nei, e kōrua. What are some of those tribal narratives around wai that you've seen have maybe had really, really beneficial impacts in either people or on the land? Hei tīmatanga, if the kōrero flows wherever, mehe wai.
Apai, hoino e te tahi o ngā rawa we tino mōhiona ki ngā kōrero a wei tahi atu. Engari rote te tahi o a māte nei mahi hei he hare te tiro te rangahau i te ika nei o te takeke. I te tahi o ngā kōrero tuku iho na te tahi o ngā kuia o roto o Ngāti Kuta Patukeha. Ko tāna kōrero ka tuku ngā takeke i warātau heki ki te pupuhuko o te tairea. Ngā tai pari ata o te ōturu o te muramura. Nā he wā o te maramataka tēnā. I mōhia i mātou a hea te rāwā ka haere atu mātou ki ngā ki parore rahi. I o akurara, tā wāhi atu i o akura. i te wā o te muatu o te paringa mai o ngā tai o te ōturu. Ka kite mātu i ngā heki wā he pupuhuka, ne? So we went over there, so that tērā kōrero, ka tuku ngā take kei warātu heki ki te pupuhuka o te tairea, ngā tai pariata o te ōturu o te muramura, is a specific maramataka day, easy to identify, because ngā tai pariata are always on the ōturu moon. Ne? And so, ka haere atu mātu, just before the night before that ōturu moon, ka kite mātu ngā pupuhuka, pai mai ana ki uta on this beautiful tide. Ka koutu hea ke mātu is scooped up the heki, the pupuhuka, roto i te pupuhuka ko ngā heki. We didn't know he hata momo. We know it wasn't a crocodile from Australia, but you know, rawa mātu I mohi he hata momo e o tērā ika. So the tamariki from there are now DNA sequencing those eggs to tell us what momo there is. So they're using modern day science to do that. So they tell you, but then they scoop some wai from that same area they get these eggs from, and they DNA sequence that wai to capture what are the companion species for that particular ika. So that's a rangahau that's going on right now with our tamariki over ngumuru parorerahi tūpare huia, just out of whangarei there. E rawa we rā kōrero. Engari e rawa we tino mohe, that's probably the only one outside of our area, and I know kei roto hoki angano, I te ākauroa, apo all those fishermen are up in miti there, nui ngā kōrero kei reira. E roto Ngāti Wai, ki roto Ngāti Rehia, ki tua. So we've got lots to do, tiro i ngā kōrero a tēnā hapu. But that's just one of those examples captured from a kuia. 4 years after her funeral, and then ka mahara mai, mara, tana kōrero tuku iho tēnei, ne? And so that's provided the basis for a whole rangahau that's being funded from Tyndall Foundation, I think, in Foundation North, for the rangatahi to go back and research using modern science and kōrero tuku iho, ne, to actually to embed a lot of that research that they're doing now. So, koe da, hoi nano tāpe e maharana mo e tahi atu iwi. Tua tēnā hoa, kuere katoa, mnoho mai uro te ngā awa, repo roto o waima.
Tāga. Whakaro anō, Irish now?
Yeah, I think one of the pūrākau that comes to mind was the story of Tuna Paia for us in Ngāti Hine. And there's so many different kōrero about Tuna Paia and what Tuna Paia was or is. And the way I got taught, or the kōrero that was shared to me by my auntie Rangi, who the kōrero was given to her by my pop, her father, Rangi Te Auahu. And Tuna Paia, it was about a journey of with a taniwha, very large tuna, and it was about his journey through the different waterways of Ngāti Hine, but really it was actually across the land, and Rereata talks about that inseparable connection between land and water. And so he was travelling through a long land and actually created the waterways of Ngāti Hine. And one place in particular, which is of importance to me, is Rereata. And I grew up at Rereata. We had the old school there, and we had probably one of my very earliest memories as a young, probably 5-year-old, at a whānau reunion that we had at Rereata school. And that place had real significance for me, and I didn't quite know why. I just remember it was this beautiful place that our whānau all came together. And I later learned that all of our whenua was buried there. So I'm one of 6 siblings, and all 6 of our whenua is buried at Rereata. And my dad only told us about this later as adults, and he said, well, that makes sense. You guys love that place so much. Your whenua is actually buried there in the garden. And when I was talking about this to my auntie Rangi, who lives at Rereata, she started to share the kōrero, the story of Tuna Paia. And in that particular place, Rereata, or Ora uta was where Tuna Paia actually came to shore and was able to kind of seek sustenance, to be able to breathe from a large flood, and to keep him from drowning effectively was the kōrero that she shared with me. And so really that place became a place of refuge and safety. And that's how I sort of understood that kōrero of Ōrauta, was a place, a safe haven for our whānau, a place of safety. And when we talked about it in terms of a water safety context, it was about having those places or those safe exit points, those places of safety where we know where our whānau can go to if we need to rest, if we need to get out of the water, etc. And so I think it's about finding those kōrero, those pūrākau from home and how they resonate with you and how you think about them. The kōrero then that's added from our kaumātua, our queer, to help us keep us safe in those places. But for me, yeah, Tuna Paia was about, it started to provide the kōrero around why our different rivers are given the different names, and returning to those traditional names of our waterways and what they can actually teach us about water safety. You know, if I look at Taikiro, for instance, up home, one kōrero that I've been taught is, you know, taiki being the sort of woven baskets, and do meaning many, hundreds. And it was referenced to the hundreds of woven baskets needed to gather the tuna. And it showed that the Taikiro River had an abundance of tuna. And so that can teach us about our tikanga and our practices around gathering that particular kai and that awa and the safety protocols, or the tikanga around that practice and how that can actually keep us safe. And so there's so much richness, there's so much mātauranga embedded in our names, in our pūrākau and those kōrero that can keep our people safe, regardless of the context, but just in my rangaho specifically, in that water safety, drowning prevention sort of light.
Beautiful, beautiful. I have seen one of the pātai that's come through, kind of talking and making reference to those first waters, especially when you mentioned those era wāhi ahuru, and thinking about that intrinsic connection as tangata tūwai. Those first waters, I roto i te kōpū o te whāia, i te wā e tupuna te pepi, ki roto i era wai, e meana nei te pātai hea te ingoa o taua wai, he te wai tuku kiri, heha ai kāre tātou tino kōrero ana mō tēnei wai. And it just reminded me as you were talking of you know, if we're looking at wai and its impact on hauora tangata, maybe we can kind of focus around there, but he kōrero a kōrua mō tērā wai o te kei i te kōpū o te whaia tonu, and then, you know, how does that come back and how we're reminded as we move through our lives and its impact on our well-being. Tēnei mea te wai. Marama tēnā?
Yeah, waiho tērā mga wāhine kōrero, te taha. Nā te mea e nui ngā wāhine mātau ana ki wera mumu kōrero, tērā mumu wai, te wai ora.
Kia ora, kia ora. Oh, I mean, Chanel, he kōrero kua, have you heard any of that kind of kōrero from your whaia growing up in relation to?
Yeah, see why for me. I'm like, no, I want to hear what he's got to say about this kōrero. So it was interesting because I actually did a talk last week for International Women's Day, and it was a kōrero that came up was, you know, as women, what sort of the role and the place of women in terms of water safety and drowning prevention. And all I could think of was that kōrero was for our mama and the importance of the wahine carrying our babies within te whare tangata, and that special connection that we have to those first waters. And then as we are sustained through the breast milk of our mothers, in the same way that the land actually supports and nurtures and sustains us as people. And, you know, we have the kupu ukaipo to really reflect that deep inherent connection. And so I probably, this is actually bringing up kōrero that I want to have a chat with my auntie Rangi more about it, but I haven't been taught anything specifically for the wahine in that space, other than sort of what I've heard along the way. And I would just love if others who probably have that kōrero and want to share it, please do on the chat, because that would be beautiful to hear.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, tika tau. How does, just kind of going out a bit, particularly around all the take tōranga pua around Wai at the moment, councils, government, and that kind of imposition of that rule over hapu and iwi, and in regards to our tikanga Wai, how do we work to look after Wai, given that imposition of colonial rules over Wai in our waters? You know, if we're thinking about us and our waters and how that we e kore tukua kia pēratia o a tātou ake wai, and extending that as we already do and involved in that space. Yeah, hei hā wetahi, ngā kaupapa kei te haere tēnei, well, what are some of the big kaupapa at the moment that you might be involved with or have any thoughts and reflections on?
O te tahi taha o tēnā mea o te wai, so we use that wai hei hakaora i te tangata, ne? It's lots of our whānau are using wai healing, ne? And e hoki ana ki e rua ngā momo tai ne ko te taitimu, the outgoing tide and the taipari. E rereke ngā wai ua ngā te taitimu, so i ngā taimaha te tangata, ka taria ki te wai. So our old people would take someone who's very Maori down to the water's edge on the taitimu, e te mea heke ana te tai. Ka tuku nā atu ngā taimaha ki runga i te taitimu, ka inoi atu ki te taitimu kia taria ngā mate nei, ngā mamai nei, ngā taimahatanga nei ki te ripo o te moana. So the ripo is the deepest part of the ocean, ne? And then ka huri te tai pakoa, ka pari mai te tai, and then they would take that tūroro down again on the incoming tide, ne? Ka haere ki te krakia tu ino atu ki te tai pari, kia pari mai te kaha ki roto o te tangata, ne? And these are healing things that people can do, right? They don't need any tohunga beside you, but haere ki te tai timu, let all the taimaha go, and then wait for the tai pari. You don't have to do it that time, but maybe the next day that ka pari mai te tai, on the incoming tide, it brings new energy, different energy, ne? Roto te tinana, roto te ngākau, roto te tangata. And sometimes you have to do it repeatedly, ne? Depending on pehea te taimaha. O rei roto i te tangata. I remember te tahi o mātou mokopuna. Every day ka taria ki te awo o Waikato. Nā tata pau te marama, neke atu te kotahi marama. Ka tahi ana ka tika mai. I mōhau and you can tell that ko ora mai, because ka text mai hore kaue aue ana, hore kaue tangi ana, ngari e ka tāwai, ne? So they send some little kōrero tāwai, he tāwai ake ko mohi koe ko ora mai, ne? So tērā te tahi atu ngā mea o ngā wai hore kaue kōrero hiana. And the mahi that our healers would do, ne? I ora atu nei wa mātou krani. He mumo wai tā rātu haere te tiki roto te ngahere. E hakaura i te tangata ka mara wiwihi ane. Mo te taha ki ngā koro ke kore take nei, e haka ture nei, wa tātou nei wai. We should actually put them through a test to see if they qualify to sit on boards like that ne. E tēnā, he hā te whakapapa o te wai. Yeah, and I think they rau au e hea ki te tāwai, te kōrero kino ki ngā hungara, but they're totally disconnected, te aronga o tēnā mea o ngā mea pupuri ana te ture ki ngā tangata e noho mai ana roto te taiao, te akauro te taiao, totally disconnected mea. Si we tahi o ngā wā mātu nei, awa kore taia mātu te toro atu, nā te mea ko turengia. Ko reserve here te taitanga, ka tuku nā mā dock, mā wai atu rānei hei kaihaka haere, ne? Nā, kua arai he atu koe i roto, kaua koe haere ki roto i o awa ki roto i o ngahere. Nā mūkua ke me whakahukia e rā mana haka haere, haka te tia ki te taiao, tia ki ngā awa nei, whakahukia mai ki ngā hapu o te kāinga, ne? No rātou e rā awa, no rātou e rā maunga.
Kia ora. Whakaro, tuahine?
My answer is probably going to be a bit dry compared to that one, but one of the things that I was thinking about was some of the mahi that I'm involved in and colleagues of mine as well is around, effectively changing the water safety sector. And so when we first started doing some mahi around water safety for Maori, there was very little in that kind of in that sort of public arena. There's very little te ao Māori in water safety. Water safety education in New Zealand didn't reflect Māori views and attitudes around water. It didn't reflect the importance of wai or our connection to it. And so really the big push that my team and I have been going for is trying to, I suppose, one, educate them, but to change the water safety sector to better reflect te ao Māori. And so that's where the kōrero of the Wai Panel model being embedded into this new strategy for water safety is kind of our way to really try to get it in there. And I think the work now, which is probably the hard part, is how do we ensure the mana and the integrity of the true intent of that kōrero is followed in an organisation that perhaps don't, or not perhaps, they don't understand it. And how do we ensure that it is looked after and it serves its purpose for the true intent of what it was, which was about strengthening our connection as Māori to wai. And so while I don't have an answer to that, it was more about ensuring that our voices, our mātauranga is embedded in policy like that. And we as Māori know it's not going to change what we're already doing in the water, but it might actually start to change some of those organisations and how they work with mana whenua in their rohe, and how they can actually bring on the iwi and hapu voices for their different regions, for their different contexts as well. And so that's really the push that we're currently working on, is trying to get them to understand that we don't need them, but they need us. And so that's one way we're trying to encourage to ensure that mātauranga is embedded within the water safety sector, so that the relationship with mana whenua is better, is stronger.
Kia ora, kia ora. It really reminds me of, you know, you could write the policies till the cows come home, but it's those practices, those everyday practices that are informed by tikanga. Like, for example, yesterday, even little things like going, you know, ka haere atu koe ki te taha moana, ki te kaukau, whatever, ka kuhu atu koe ki te wānui a tāne. My baby and I took her just to Puketi yesterday, just ki te haere, ki te tiro i ngā rākau. Pai mua I te kuhutanga, te tomokanga, ki roto I te ngahere, I pakutuku karaki, pakutuku mihi, and that was like, you know, it was a good reminder. That's part of the health and safety thing too. You know, our karakia, our mihi, so kia noho whakaiti tonu tātou, hu Māori e tonu tātou, I taia, you know, because too much do we think as tangata, especially in the West, anything we can do, we can do. There's no processes we go through to ki te tera, that process of pōwhiri. We were talking yesterday, Papa, that process of pōwhiri, even in those little moments when you interact, and then that brings back, you know, the respect. It's a good reminder. How kōrero whakaro on that? Moira practices, like if you're talking with helping to empower and remind people who might be us, all of us, as tangata, we might feel disconnected because of the way we live now. How do we reconnect and reaffirm that identity and that ko koe, ko au, ko au, ko koe whakaro?
I think mūkuake, there's that disconnection you're talking about is kei reira te tahi o ngā raru nui when we're dealing with people like councils and government departments. Ko te mate ke o tēnā, and the reason for that is that for the last 180 something years, our pūrākau kōrero tuku iho was left out of our education system, and they're labelled as myths and legends and not to be believed. And yet, te nuinga o tātou nei mātauranga heke mai o ua kōrero tuku iho. And I only wish I had Dallas's tuhinga in her report that she cultural impact assessment mō rangitāne I Kerikeri. Beautiful explanation there of why our myths and legends and kōrero tuku iho are so important in guiding our practices of the future. And kei reira ke te raurau, that we have a disconnect from the other side, o re kaue mōhi ona, ki wa tātou kōrero. Hoa pēhea to tātou pahu, haka puta i wa tātou nei kōrero tuku iho, ho re kaue tau ana ki roto te hinengaro o te hunga, e mahi ture ana. And I think there is one of the greatest disconnects of all, that our kōrero tuku iho will not find a platform to change things on roto ngā mahi a ngā kaungihira, kāwanatanga, nā tā rātou kuare, kore mōhio, kore whai whakaro, ki ngā kōrero tuku iho ao tātou nei mātua tūpuna. And when we talk about waika, pē rātou, kore hakarongo, I roto ke o rātou nei, o re kau rātou e aro mai ana ki wa tātou nei kōrero tuku iho.
What have been some instances where that are successful, kua whai hua I te rātaha, kua mārama te rātaha? Have you both seen any examples where that has been a success on the other side? Kua mārama rātou, they have actually, kua taupai, or are we kei te whawhai tonu, tērā whawhai o re kaua no kia, I roto I a korua takahanga?
I think we're tai ko timata, te huri, ngā whakaro. Engari, do we wait another 180 years kia tau te maramatanga? I don't think our paiao's got 180 years to wait. Ko raru I aia tunu nei, te rate mate. Pe hea te horo o tā rātou hupuake.
What's the whakautu? He aha wetahi o ngā kaupapa e haere ana I tēnei wā, he mea kaupari I tērā, he mea tutu, he whakarewa kaupapa e tutuki ai ngā hia, e mahi nei kōrua. What are some of those kaupapa that you're both involved with? Papa, I know you're talking about some of the innovation space that you are currently involved with, especially with our rangatahi. He aha wetahi ngā mea whakaweawe e haere ana.
Kapa, I got the finger, so I'll go. I'm always wanting to listen to Papa Rereata talk first. Yeah, I think even if we go back to those tikanga, what is it that we're actually doing in and around the wai? And when we go and teach our rangatahi, for instance, around reconnecting with the wai and the water safety aspects around it, even just using the word water safety, brings up all these connotations and thinkings from our rangatahi that's usually quite in that Te Ao Pākehā space. And it's only when we then say, okay, well, if we break it down, what is whakapapa in the context of water safety? What is mātauranga and what is tikanga? And their answers are all different. And so I think that's the real part for us, is when we're teaching water safety from our perspective, we're often using things like we're using now whakapapa, mātauranga and tikanga, because that is water safety for Maori. And that's what the Wai Panel model really looks at and is grounded on. And so when we're going in, what is the tikanga around the water? How is that keeping you and your whānau safe? And so often that tikanga is about that respect for the wai. And there's so many different ways we can respect wai. When we teach even life jacket use, a lot of kids know, put on a life jacket and why that might keep you safe. But for us, we also talk about, okay, well then if we're thinking about the spiritual life jacket, what is that? Is that our karakia? Is that adhering to rāhui? Mo ira atu momo. And so I think that's actually a space as well as rāhui. You know, if we look at the past summer drownings where I think there was 3 instances of the drownings out of 9 that we looked at where someone drowned during a rāhui. And so really trying to understand why is that happening? Is it people don't know the practice of rāhui? They just think it's a Maori thing, so they don't need to adhere to it. And what are some of those, you know, what is in place? What does rāhui actually do for us in terms of that water safety context? So yes, it's about cleansing and it's about clearing that tapu of that place. It's about respecting the whānau as well and their grieving as well. But also it's this cultural practice of safety. It's allowing time to figure out what happened, what went wrong. Is there something in the wai that needs to be flushed out and we can't enter into it for that particular reason? And so trying to get back to some of those tikanga for us. And I think if we go back to maybe some instances where it's maybe working in that sort of te ao Māori, te ao Pākehā space, the ones I can think of is where Maori are leading it, obviously. And so that's really where I think it's where Maori are leading, the organisations, the government, the councils, whoever, they're stepping aside and they're letting them lead, letting us lead. And so that's really where I think the real change can come, is when we're not only heard, but we're the ones actually leading out on that action.
Kia ora, kia ora. I think that ties really nicely into one of these pātai around rangahau. There's a massive interest in investment in rangahau mātauranga Māori between iwi Māori and science institutions. What are the panelists whakaaro on how this research can benefit tangata o ngā hapori Māori? Reconnect us, as Chanel refers to.
Oh, kia ora. Hey, I got with me 2 rangatahi. That we have engaged as the new kai rangahau po te tiro taiao. And so our pōpō, we're going out to a kurutai area called Onoke. But te mahi a ngā rangatahi tēnei wise to align there are a number of things, but one of the things is to align the maramataka. And one of the key alignments in any maramataka is your rao te tangaro kiokio. So ngā tohu o te tangaro kiokio, ka kite koe te ngā kiore i te ao ātea, kiore i te ao ātea, pātiki i te ao ātea, me te tuna i te ao ātea. So ko mau ia rātou, so using motion capture cameras, ko mau ia rāu a te ngā kiore o te tangaro kiokio o te maramaku hipa, nā ka tiro ake i Onoke, te wā ka te tangaro kiokio, me he mea kei reira tunu ngā pātiki i te ao ātea, nā ka haere anō ki te tiro i ngā tuna, nei wera ngā tohu o te tangaro kiokio. Me he mea ka tae koe te pau i te tangaro kiokio mo tau ake rohe, and then you can set your maramataka for that whole 30 days, kei mua i a koe rā, ne? And those activities will repeat, ne? E ai ki ngā taka o te marama. And so part of that rangahau is understanding and being in, understanding ngā kaupeka o te tau, ngā taka o te marama, aligning those days, and hea ngā tirohanga, hea ngā kitenga, roto i te taiao, roto i te moana, roto i te awa, roto i te ngahi. And so we've got, got a bit of mahi ahead of us, but it'll be fun mahi, ne? Kei kone ngā, so they've just been brought on board. Te tahi e kura tonu ana ki te kura i hokianga. Te tahi ka tahi ana ka mutu mai te kura i Panguru. So a couple of taiohi and working in these areas that had never been researched before. Ne? So based on ngā matiti o te raumati, ngā kaupeka o te raumati, me ngā kaupeka o te hōtoke. Yeah, so they'll watch and see the changings, and hopefully that we can detect te tainga mai o te hau o te, ka pū mai te hau o te ninihi. Te wiki tuarua pēr o te marama o mei, te wehe, kia tāua, kōrero te tohu, ka tīmata te taia o te kapi. Ne? So that's when the hau o te ninihi comes in, and then the taia starts to shut down. Ne? Ki te koe te rereke o ngā mahi o roto te taia during those ka taka atu tāta ki te wero i te ninihi, wero i te kōkota, wero i te whakataka pungarehu, takuru auru, takuru angana, takuru aio, and then we're back into those matiti of the raumati. Ne? So that idea that there was a summer, autumn, winter and spring, tell them take it back to England. Hore kau tērā no konei. Ngari, huri ana tā tātou taia o ki raro i ngā matiti o te raumati, ngā wero o te hōtoke, hoi nāno. There's no summer, autumn, winter, or spring I konei. We have 7 kaupeka o te raumati and 6 kaupeka o te hōtoke.
Miharo. Hea pititanga, Chanel?
It was awesome. I think for us, like definitely in institutions and probably more speaking to tertiary institutions, because that's where I currently work, is, there is a huge push now for more mātauranga within the tertiary space. But the key importance here is who is going to be the kaitiaki of that mātauranga. It's one thing to sort of say, we need it more. Now everyone has to have a vision mātauranga statement. They have to be saying how their research is going to support Māori. But if people on those panels who are reading them don't understand, then they're just a tick box kind of thing that's happening. And so what we can really only do is come from our wee corner of the world. And so that's ensuring that our research is kaupapa Māori research, where it is always going to benefit Māori communities. It's where we can get our tauira out and trying to encourage them to choose research projects alongside their communities, find out what it is that their whānau, that their hapu, that their iwi are wanting investigated, and then aligning their research projects alongside their own whānau and their own hapu and their own iwi. And so that's very much the way I got brought through the university. Associate Professor Anne-Marie Jackson and Dr. Hawati Hakopa through our kaupapa of Te Koronga, our Indigenous Science Research theme. And we were encouraged as students to find rangahau that we were passionate about, but that was also connected to our communities. And it was really about reflecting and uplifting the hopes and dreams of our communities through our research and now through our teaching as well. And so what that looks like is going to be different. But I think in my context, it was trying to understand what water safety looked like for all of those communities that I worked alongside of, and what it was that their aspirations were. So many of them were reconnecting their rangatahi back to the ancestral waterways, back to the awa tupuna, and that was their kaupapa. And I then talked about how that was actually a practice or evidence of water safety, and then sharing kōrero from that. So I do think that there is a huge wave of change coming in terms of that tertiary space for, the big, got a big review on the research and innovation enterprise space. Vision Mātauranga is another example, but I just think we as Māori academics, we need to be able to provide that space of safety for our students coming through to support them in building their kaupapa Māori expertise, so that we can ensure that that next generation of students coming through are grounded in who they are grounded in research that supports the aspirations of our Māori communities. So yeah, it's awesome to see it's there. But it comes with a bit of a warning, I suppose.
Beautiful. Ai, whakaro ake au, papa, ka hoki ake ki te te nuka i hangaia wiramu serets te tuakana raka, i te puta i a koe tērā rārangi whakapapa. Nā reira, i whakaaro au, hei timatanga ki tēnei hanga hāwhetanga o te kōrero, te whakamututanga pēr o te kōrero. E te iwi, this is a bit of a nuka, bit of a game. Mā papa au e whakatika ki te he au, ki te hapa hau, hoi anō. Nā reira, whai mai rā i ahau e te whānau. This is, as I was just explaining, the whakapapa of the wai that Papa talks about. Wiramu Sarich, our tohunga tākoro Maori here in Tai Tokerau, took that and put some āheinga ringa to it. As he does with everything, he just like, ka hopu, ka waihangatia, etahi nuka engari. Yeah, so just follow along, and I might check up in the chat. Ngā ingoa nei, hei, kia mōhio ai koutou. Actually, I'll do that now. Pai ana tērā, papa, kia tuku i ngā ingoa. Ki tā tātou chat, kia ora. Everybody. Ana, koe nei. Ko ngā ingoa, nā reira whai mai, nā reira kōrero mai, whakatau ānuku, whakatau ārangi. Ko pipi, so your little pinkies, always right over left, okay? So the first one always right over left. Ko pipi, ko wawai. Nā reira, ko pipi, right over left, ko wawai, left over right. Tai tua, left, right over left, tai aro. Reira anō, tai tua, tai aro. Ha mui, right over left. Ha mui, right over left. Ue papatanga roa, left over right. Ue papatanga roa. Ue pōhewa, right over left, the index. Ue pōhewa, taitini. Left over right, taitini. Maruarangi, right over left, the thumbs. Maruarangi. Maroro tua uri te awha. Maroro tua uri te awha. And here's the tricky bit. So you've got to go. Ka taka noa mai te ue atapu kia tangaroa whakamautai. Nā reira anō. Nā reira, ka taka noa mai te uatapu kia tangaroa whakamautai. Anyway, you got to practice that. Ko hanga undexterous whakubati te rangi nei. Hoi anō rā. Kei reira ngā aua ingoa I ho mai e papa. Papa paku ka tākoe te paku whakamahara mai I aua ingoa anō ki te iwi.
Te hakamārama.
Hakamārama. Reo rua pēr.
Hei, no e. Mōkua ke haere ngā tahiana te pipi rawa ko wawai, ne. Ko tērā te puna wai me te tōna puna wai o raru tō te whenua. Nā ko taitua rawa ko tai aro he ngā awa wera, ne. Ngā waikeri, ngā awa te reana runga I a papa tuanuku, ne. E runga te tuaro o papa tuanuku, te taitua. Nā ko tai aro he rere ana ki te aro o te whenua. Ka taka atu ki roto mua, te taka ngā atu ki roto o te moana, ne. Nā ko hā mui rawa ko ue papatangaroa. Ko wera, so those are the freshwater aquifers you find under the sea, ne. And it's a very special place where those who are living close to the sea, especially down the east coast there, they know where these areas are. E rapuhiana ngā tauiwima, these areas, because they're very special. Nei te rā mai e pupu ake ana, taitua rau, a hāmuimui rau ko ue papatangaroa. Ko te ue pōhewa, rau ko tautini e ahua pēnei anō pēr me te hi aku o tēnei mea te wai ki te hei kohu ki te rangi, ne. Nā ka taka maka kei hea tāua ia e nei, ue pakatanga, ue pohe tautini, nā ko maru ārangi, rau ko māroro tua uri i te āwha, ko era ka haruru te rangi, ka pātere mai ko te ua. Nā, i roto i tērā haka papa hoki ka tau mai ki te tahi o ngā taha ko te tangata, ne. Tērā te kōrero, pēr te haka mārama, probably the explanation of that kōrero ko wai tātou, ne, he wai tātou. Ko se heke ngā tahi mai ana te whakapapo te wai me te tangata. If that makes sense.
Beauty. Ātāhua. And I know hei he nuka, he mea whakaihihi, whakahiko tērā, especially mo ngā tamariki, ngā noho, i ngā marae, kua mahia era I mua, and rawe kia rā te o tira, koe rā ngā kurahuna, ngā kākano ka whakatongia. Nā kōrero tuku nā reo. Tēnā koe papa, mau I whakaarake, I te hora hoki nei whakapapa. But you raise a really, really good point, I think, which is the point of everything, ko wai tātou, ne? He wai katoa rere ana I roto I te tinana o te tangata, we are intrinsically water. So what, I suppose, hey, mo tēnei wāhanga whakamutunga kia tātou, if you think about some of those main things around wai, how it connects to you and what impacts it has on you as a person that you've spoken about. He ha ngā tino kaupapa, pia e hihiana te kōrero, te tuari, what are some of those real big challenges and kaupapa that we face as Maori now to do with wai? We've talked about some of them, but what are the main challenges, I suppose, that face us as Maori here in Aotearoa and abroad globally around wai? And what might be some of the hua, the huarahi, Miki?
Matua Rereata is looking down, so that might mean I have to go first. I think, and I've spoken to it, I think one of my key passions is around haumaru tangata, mai kiuta ki tai. And so thinking about water safety from the mountains to the sea in this sort of, I guess, holistic way of thinking about wai. So in the same way we were trying to teach about water safety, say in the moana, it's the exact same as if we're talking about, safer river crossings up in the Maunga, for instance. And it's really about going back to our tikanga being derived from our mātauranga and then connecting us to our whakapapa. Is very much some of the main kaupapa that I'm involved in. And I think when we're thinking about water safety for Māori, and I said this before, we have this high drowning rate for Māori, particularly our tāne. And while there's some kōrero out there about why that might be the case, often it's kōrero Pākehā and it's not resonating with us. A lot of our water safety messaging hasn't been resonating with us. If I can give a bit of an example, one key one is if in doubt, stay out. And so that's just a really key message that often means if the water's not looking good or things like that, stay out of the water. But in a te ao Māori sense, we don't ever want to disconnect ourselves from the wai. We're not disconnecting who we are from where we are. And for us in Ngāti Hine, the best time to get the silver-bellied tuna is after a flood or just after a flood. And so often the waters are really high. And so there's a lot more dangers and hazards involved in that gathering of kai. And so messages where it's saying just stay out often don't reflect what we need to be doing. And so what were some of those kōrero, those taonga tuku iho, or the kōrero tuku iho, about how we can be kept safe while we practice our tikanga. And so that's the part that we're trying to re-engage and reconnect with as well. And when I think about water safety for our whānau, it's about strengthening our whakapapa. It's about considering our mātauranga, going back to those pūrākau that Matua Rereata spoke about, it's, you know, those pūrākau are our water safety knowledge, are our water safety messaging, and then how we can actually bring that out to teach our tamariki and rangatahi today. And so that's really the push that I'm involved in, is trying to show that water safety for Māori is about that strength and connection to wai, by adhering to tikanga, mātauranga and whakapapa. We're not saying the Western stuff is wrong. We're not saying don't wear a life jacket. We're not saying, you know, be safe on a boat. But what we're saying is that our tikanga, our mātauranga and our whakapapa have to be embedded in those messages for it to resonate and reflect te ao Māori, for it to, yeah, support Māori communities. So that's probably one of the core kaupapa, and I suppose a current challenge for us in the water safety space, is to ensure the safety of our tamariki, of our whānau. But then also when we think about water safety education, quite often it's taught just age-based, so just teaching kids or just teaching adults rather than the whole whānau unit. And also it's often teaching in pools where it's, you know, a bit more controlled. And so the part of the research that we're involved in, Tangaro Araro, is looking at how can we teach pukinga wai, how can we teach tikanga, this Māori water safety, to whānau groups in open water environments, in those areas that we have that whakapapa and that connection to. And how do we go about teaching that those pūrākau and those kōrero. And so that's, yeah, very much the sort of mahi that I'm involved in, and probably my core passion. Kia ora, Matua Rereata.
Beautiful.
Oh, kia ora. Tēnā tātou. One of the things about wai he anō te kōrero is that when we were growing up out in Hokianga here, one of the things we used to go to at the end of March, when those heavy rains came, ka tere ngā tuna. So we'd go up to the awa, number of places. One of those awa was the Punaki tere, and at the junction to Otaua there, that was one of the areas we used to go and set up over there, tere ngā tuna. And interesting, I taua wā, that the tuna heke would come down, but they'll send their tūtei in scouts in mua. They send the scouts out in front, and you let them go by, and you can see that big mob of tuna tere mai ana te awa. And without a word of a lie, you know, when the ka pahure mai ngā tuna, when they were coming down, you couldn't see the bottom of that Punaki Tere River. It was just black with tuna. And so we'd fill up all our bag and our 44-gallon drums and take them home and smoke them there. And this would happen every year. And the other areas we used to go to was over at Poroti, with the whānau over there. We'd stay over there a whole week. E hopu tuna te mai. Ka haka hokia ki Waima, ki te haka me te pāwhara. And then the other one, which I didn't go to, but the other areas our old people went to, was over at Mangamuka. And my brothers went to that one. I didn't go that time. I don't know what happened. I must have been playing up, so they told me I had to stay home. But ki hei au I haere. But when the brothers came back, they talked about tēnei mea te whiri tuna. When the tuna were so plentiful, they were actually rolling down the river in a whiri, in a ball, just wrapped up in a ball and rolling down the Mangamuka River. And I've never seen that. But the rata nei kōrero, e pērā ana ko te whiri tuna tērā. And those are some of the things that we're going to be going out to research with our kairangahau, to see whether those tuna pēhea te nui. And I'm suspecting that the numbers will be small because all the swamplands have gone there. The habitat for our tuna has been killed off. So I'm not expecting to see huge numbers. But so tērā te tahi o ngā mea tiro ana mātou. I tēnei wā mō tēnei mea o mō te wai. And one of the other projects we're working on at i ngā mahinga kai, shifting the whānau into this idea of ko te wai te tuatahi ne, nā haka tū papakainga te mea tuatahi ko te wai. So looking at the sources of the wai, you got your puna wai, then you got your awa awa, then you got your capture and storage, ne? E toru e rā momo. And so, e a mātou I te kāinga, we're having a look at all those things, e hakaoki mai, hakaora mai ngā puna wai o te kāinga. So we got over 100 ingoa papa kāinga just in Waima. And each papa kāinga had a puna wai. So that tells you how te tini o ngā puna wai I te wawa, so where are they now? Hau ke ana mātou ki te rapu I wera, hakaora mai ngā puna wai te tuatahi, me te tiro I ngā awa awa, and then also looking at the capture and storage, ne, for the mahi ngā kai mo ngā kāinga e rā momo mea, because wai is going to be critical, ne, ngā rai tū mai ne, and it's not just for the tangata, but for mo te tai au katoa, ne, te ngahere mo ngā manu, ngā wera mea katoa.
Kia ora. I think that raises a really important point that maybe we could dive into. And it goes back to the whakapapa o te wai ko rongo au I a koe kōrero ana mo te, rawa a tātou tūpuna I inu I te wai heke mai ana I te rangi, me haere mā te Maori, kokohia ke I te Maori a papa I te tuatahi, I mua I te inumanga. Engari, how do we reconcile that now, katahi, karua with ngā wara kei te heke mai, and as things change, and climate change is another kaupapa in we could weave into this section of our kōrero, but particularly around kohi o te wai mo te tangata te take, but also for drier spells. We've had 2 droughts in the last 2 years. How do we, not everybody has a puna wai, so mā te tirohanga Māori, and from a Māori worldview, our collection of wai for drinking water particularly, but even how we then, particularly how we then manage wastewater. So yeah, karuku ki tērā, a kete, kōrero pēr.
Ko tēnā mea te kia nei hoki ko te wastewater, te rā te mahi a moana tui te repo. Ne, e haka mai o mo wai, hore koe he ana kia tere ki te moana. And so wā he momo experiment, I suppose, I tēnei wā, to bring back some of those repo. Ka tuku nātu e turu atu ki roto I pāngai te roti ngā repo, ma te repo e haka mā, e horo I ngā harane I oua wai e kia nei ko te wastewater rā, ne. So figuring out he hane ngā momo hakatōtanga ki roto I taua repo. Raupo can do some things, the kuta can do other things, the kōrari can do other things. Te kārera e rā momo mea kato roto te repo, but what is it that can help me he ngote ake e haka orara I te rā momo wai e kia nei he tātou ko te wastewater, ne. Me rau e tahi o ngā mea tiro hea ke ana mātou runga wa mātou papakainga.
Kia ora. And hey apititanga ki tērā, what, like on a personal scale or a household scale or a papakainga scale, he hau e tahi rautaki, ne te whakamahi pēr I ngā tino o tēnei mea te repo, o tēnei atua, what are, like, and I'm, hey, tuari atu, I'm doing an experiment now. We live in a little tiny home, and our wastewater or our grey water, it doesn't have any of the black water in it, but we're putting that through a 3-tiered bath system, that design where it has a worm farm at the start. So ka haere te waima, worm farm, get filtered out, and then it goes through a bath that has a baffle in the middle filled with scoria and has those reeds on the top. Kia ata tātari here, and then it goes into another holding tank which has some of those more floating plants to do a further filtration. But like in the innovation space, if you're a kāinga and you want to not have the septic tank, or you're building a new papa kāinga and you want to find other ways of using more biological processes or taiao, is that area that you're seeing any innovation or any, I suppose, moving away from the standard the mainstream kind of wastewater management, any of those particular in our Māori, and using mātauranga Māori?
Ai, ko te mea tuatahi, ko te ngahere, ne? Te wāhi hei hakaora i ngā para, ne? Ngā para te tango ko te ngahere. Te tuatahi, tau ko tahi me te repo, engari ka kaua tukuna e rā tudu wai hei no runga i ngā mahi ngā kai, ne? No muri mai o te mate ngahere me te ngā repo e whakahau, nā muri mai o tērā pia ka wātea ka āhei te hakamahi mo runga i ngā mahi ngā kai. I kaua tuku tika atu ki runga i ngā mahi ngā kai, e rā wāhi e whāngai ana i te tangata, i te tuatahi nea.
Chanel whakaroa?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that question. No, I'm a complete townie. And so my wastewater management is all the Western way. We've just moved into a new whare that's on septic tank now. So where I grew up in Greytown, we're on, rainwater, etc. as well. And so you learn to respect why you do have. But no, I very much wouldn't know anything in that innovation space, and I think that's where that kōrero from Jared Ma is just going to be so amazing, because I suspect that they would have a lot of kōrero in that space too. But no, I'd be the worst person to answer that question, because total town.
Even just thinking about the impacts, and here's the other kaupeka around this way, is the impacts of climate change. He mea tera, because again, that's another, I would say, at least mainstream Western paradigm, climate change. The climate's been changing since day dot of te tīmatanga o te ao. But, like, he ha kōrua whakaro mo te climate change in reference to wai. And he anga challenger, he anga ngā mea, hei mahi matata.
Well, mea te tahi kōrero, he kupu te kai whakahei te whakaaro. He kupu ana o te kai whakatika i te whakaaro. I'm thinking that the people who are using this climate change are using it for to divert attention to the climate. They blame it the climate, not the climate te he. It diverts it away from the real culprit, and that's the degradation of our papa tuanuku. And so that conversation for me, karo ke ana te tangata, and their responsibilities. So they start talking about climate change, and te mea pauri kiau is that in order to go and fix things up, me tahuri atu koe ki warātou nei aronga, warātou nei, tō rātou nei science nei, e hakarau ora i te taiao. So my test where everyone is trying to put in a kaupapa to go and fund the hakaora i te ngā awa, the restoration based on the kōrero tuku iho, and see how well you do. Mōkua ke, tērā ke te disconnect in order to get our awa and our repo all back to where they should be working to help hakaora i te taiao. Te ua, not te mea ko ngā pūte hakapau ni ana hore kau haere mai ana ki runga i te kaupako Māori. Ngari me noho tahi koe me ngā koro ke science nei. So kei reira kia nei te tahi o ngā raru nui mo tēnei mea mo te hakaora i wā tātou wai.
I think there's some awesome mahi going on at the moment with one of the new cores, Centre of Research Excellence, Coastal People, Southern Skies, and that kaupapa is really about how do we look at, I guess, the well-being of our coastal communities and our coastal ecosystems, and how they go hand in hand together. And so looking at how can mātauranga I guess do that change how can Matalanga support the well-being of our coastal communities and the coastal ecosystems in this sort of changing climate? And I love what Rereata said about, even the word climate change brings a lot of connotations and sort of blame on the climate itself and not the people and the tangata in which are impacting on our climate, on Papatūānuku, on our waterways, etc. And so that kaupapa for coastal people, Southern Skies, is really about the importance of well-being alongside, I guess, that mātauranga or that science, or sort of the marine science as well, and how they can go hand in hand to support the coastal ecosystems and the communities in which live by them. And so that work is really supporting Maori and Pacific communities as well, and how we can look at some of those shared stories between Maori and the wider Pacific, who, many of our Pacific, whānau Pacific communities are seeing the direct impacts of sea level rise, etc. We're seeing the impacts on some of our kai, the different sizes now of pipi beds, where are our pipi beds moving? Are they getting a lot smaller? Same thing with tuna, and how that whole wider ecosystem is so delicate, and how we need to be changing our ways and our thinking. And that's where that mātauranga space is really going to be key in order for us to do that, in order for us to change how we're behaving in and around the water, around the land, so that we stop having those bad impacts, and we can actually start to support the wai and the whenua.
Absolutely. And ko kite, just like COVID, there's been the impacts of that narrative around climate change has been quite significant on rangatahi, on well-being, so how, he hanga mo te hunga rangatahi. What are some of those strategies that can help reconcile that? How can to help strengthen that connection, that identity that they have, with their areas, their own whakapapa, and see that connection between local and global. Tērā mo te hunga rangatahi, those impacts that the narratives have on them, and then their perception on the world, the sky's falling. E hara I te mea pērā ana, engari, anei ngā huarahi, anei ngā mea, anei ngā kaupapa, hei mahi ngā mā koutou. Do you think there is a big, those types of narratives have a massive impact on our whakatupuranga kei te haere? And particularly, like all the protests that happened a few years ago, massive movement around that. Our generation coalescing around that story, that concept, is how can we as Māori respond to that and maybe redirect some of that energy into kaupapa that we deem that is more appropriate, or actual practical things that we can implement as tangata whenua o Aotearoa nei?
Wena te tūmana ko I tēnei taha. That a couple of our rangatahi researchers ko tīmata, tahi ana ka tīmata roto tēnei mahi te tiro tai au. Hopefully that what we can grow out of this is that we can develop how te mera curriculum marau ne? Curriculum? Curriculum of learning that can filter back through all our kura. Mareira, so that te pūtaketanga mai ko te kōrero tuku iho rātu nei mātua tūpuna, and ka rangahau ai ki ngā tirohanga o ngā tūpuna, ne? And ka haere mai te taha ki te Western science, a muri mai, ne? A muri mai o te tirohanga o te taiao ai ki ngā kōrero tuku iho. so that science follows the mātauranga Māori, but mātauranga Māori leads the inquiry space and not the other way around. And I think the mahi nui mā tātou is how do we get this developed as a curriculum of learning for all our kura kaupapa i te tuatahi, I roto wa tātou kura Māori. Hei marātou hei arataki o ngā reanga hakatuturanga. Because I think our planning is too short term. Mōku ake 100 years from now is short term. Me tiro ke tātou out to 1,000 years now. Te oranga o te taiao, te oranga mō a tātou mokopuna. And I think that's a big shift to make in any, whether government, local bodies, or marae, or whānau hapu, is to think 1,000 years from now. He hanga mea ka waiho I hoi, mō a tātou mokopuna ngā uri whakatupu. E ora ai te taiao, e ora ai ngā kai hoki mai ano, ngā pipi, ngā tāmure, ngā pātiki, ngā kanai, o era momo kai, ngā kai o ngā manu o te ngahere, era momo mea. And so 100 years isn't going to do it. So he nui te rā pātai, te oranga whakaora mai te taiao. And I think we're up against it, a huge challenge. But e hara kei te rei te mea ke noho pū, ke kau e mahi, ke māngere tātou, ngari me ruku atu ki te hakatō, ngā rākau I tika ana mo te hakaora mai ngā wawa, hare te tiro, te tiaki ngā puna wai, hare te tiaki te moana, me te mahara ko te moana tīmata mai ana I te tihi o ngā maunga. I think those sorts of things, and get our rangatahi to doing all the research for the future. Hei aha nohe o ngā porua pene me mātua e noho mai ne tone hoi, noho mai haka mahana I ngā tūru, engari me tukuna mā te tirohanga o ngā taiohi, ngā rangatahi nei tātou e arataki. Nei te ara me whaitia tātou a muri ake nei.
Kia ora, tāhua. He koirā tētahi o ngā tino pēr rerekētanga I wai o tō tātou ao he tirohanga whānui. Tērā ki te tirohanga o tō ake ono te kau ki te waru te kau tau e hi koe ana I te mata o te whenua. So how do we bring back that intergenerational, and I think what you said, ma te reanga kaumātua, mātou ngā whakatupuranga haere ake e whakamahara e tiro ki te paitawhiti. He aha, a te, whitu whakatupuranga reanga haere mai nei, ka pēhea rātou, ka pēhea tō tātou ao, and it's setting up that like intergenerational infrastructure. Not just relying on the mainstream infrastructure or the Western paradigm, but he hawa tātou ake infrastructure, kua roa ke e mahiti ana, e haere ana. Because, even down to the macro nuclear family level, we're little islands living in, and I think we were talking about it yesterday, Papa, different ways that we live now as whānau. We don't live as papakainga anymore. So because of that, does that impact how we think and feel of our taiao? E kita ana tātou I te taiao e paru ana I tuki no tiana, we don't, because our connection there, our bond isn't as strong as it once was, potentially because of the way we live now. Does that then mean that we become more, we take that for granted, we become complacent? We rā mō mea. I'm reminded of the 2,000-year kaupapa going in te warawara around te whakaoratanga, te karanga o tāne mahata, rongo tērā kaupapa. But yeah, the rangatahi are setting up a plan, a 2,000-year plan for te au warawara, te ngahere o te au warawara. But kaupapa like that are amazing, and it needs to be a part of our everyday, because we're such fleeting beings. I runga I te mata o te whenua engari, ko te whakapapa te mea ka maurua. So how do we set up our whakapapa for success, a haere ake nei, and be adaptable to our world? I don't know. It's fucking kōrero.
I'll jump in then. I love always loved that kōrero from Matua. You know, the importance of teaching our kids. And so what I heard and what really resonated was the Matalanga needs to come first and the science follows, not the other way around. And I think for me and my upbringing, when I think about it, that's absolutely what I wish I had growing up was, you know, being taught the pūrākau, being taught our whakapapa kōrero, and only in my adult life, because I wanted to, and I had that yearning, I suppose I had that yearning for learning more about who I was. Did I go out and seek it? And imagine if all our kids just had that, if they all got that education, if they were taken out to the taiao, taught about the whakapapa of Wai, and more iratu momo, like how powerful that would be. And so that's very much, I just loved saying that, like what Matua was saying about building a curriculum around the taiao, and what that might look like and how that can support our future generations. You know, we have heard that kōrero about, you know, the sky's falling and, you know, our generations today are all scared and worried, etc., etc. But I do think that that younger generation are more, I suppose, taiao inclined. They are thinking about the environment and the impacts of people. It may be a Pākehā whakaaro, a Western whakaaro, kei te pai tira. I think our whakapapa will find a way to draw us back in the same way that it did for me. You know, and I think that's the beauty of whakapapa, is that if we are unfortunate to not have that teaching and that learning as a young pipi and then as a tamariki into rangatahi and taiohi, you know, hopefully we find that later in life as adults. But I do think that the power of teaching our kids young the importance of taiao and where that comes from that te ao Māori space, from mātauranga, a iwi, a hapu, for instance. And yeah, and I think I'm just reminded, listening to the kōrero, about how, yeah, I guess about how I found my reconnection back to all of those places, and then those memories and those moments you had as a kid start to make more sense. And so I think that's the beauty of whakapapa. It gives you that chance. It might take a wee bit more longer for some people, but it gives you that opportunity to understand some and pull back some of those layers and probably understand a little bit deeper what's been going on as you've been going through your life of Wai and interacting with te ao. Yeah, I'm kind of rambling on now, but that was a beautiful kōrero from Matua there, because I think that's so important, is teaching our kids young. And that whakaaro of theirs will change as well, so that it is reflective of te ao Māori and their upbringings, and where they can start to draw on some of those things that resonate and reflect their worldviews.
Beautiful. I think that's a really nice summing as well. And yeah, I like e kore mutu ngā kōrero mo tēnei mea te wai. Nā reira, ki te whakaaroa, ki te hohonutanga o ngā kōrero ko puta i a kōrua i te rangi nei, te ata nei, hei tū apapa mo ngā kōrero kei te haere, kei te mihi, e mihi nui ana. Before we wrap up, just wondering if there's any final whakaaro that you both have around the kaupapa of Wai and all the beautiful kōrero that you've laid out for us this morning. Just really, really reminded of the importance of remembering ko Wai ahau. Going back to whakapapa, ngā kōrero tuku iho me ngā pūrākau, and seeing and remembering, you know, seeing ourselves in Wai and remembering that we are Wai. Koe rā te mea nui, because, you know, ki te tātou i tō tātou, you know, i tōku whāia, i tōku matua, e wharana, you know, ka puta te aroha, ki aia, engari, me pērā hoki ki ngā Wai, me pērā hoki ki te whenua. And until we get that and remember that intrinsic connection and respect, you know, te rā whakanui, whakaute, I think ka pēnei tia tātou, ka pēnei tia te taiao, ka pēnei tia te Wai. So yeah, no, he whakaaro whakamutu, he kōrero whakamutu ngā kōrua, e mua i ta tātou whakakapinga ake.
Kono he pukaro tēnei that mōku ake, there probably needs to be a curriculum of study designed specifically around Matalanga Māori that leads to career pathways into taiao. And we don't have that yet. So our tamariki coming out of our kura, ka haereki wetahi atu mai, ka mutu ngā horanga. Because those career pathways kei te rata ho te taiapa. Me he mea ka taia, mōku ake, ko huri hia te taiao nei, ka huri hia designing a curriculum of learning, curriculum of study that leads to career pathways mo te taiao e ai ki te ao Māori.
Tēnā koe. Tuahine.
I just want to tautoko that. That was the perfect answer. And all I was thinking when Matua was saying that was, okay, yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. How can we do that? And so, yeah, we'll pick up that tono. And I think probably in parting words, I think for me, if I return back to the Toi Parapara that I shared earlier for me and my whānau of Ngāti Hine, you know, that Toi Parapara for me has been a journey as well. And it kind of pops up every now and then in sort of unexpected ways. And I feel like that is what whakapapa in practice looks like when we're not really looking or we're not really sure what's happening. You know, our whakapapa will find a way to tell us what we need to be doing, to tell us who we need to be talking to, and to tell us the next kaupapa, that next mahi of importance for us and our people. And so if I go back to that Toi Parapara, for us it was about not only being able to reconnect to our awa tupuna and those important chiefly waters of where we're from, but it's also about the hua, the kai that comes from them. And so I'm just reminded of the kaupapa for our you know, for our kaupapa for the next 3 days around those hua. And so that encouragement to seek out those people, those places that have each given you all the inspiration for your aspirations. Seek out those tohu, those symbols, those hua tau, those metaphors that really resonate and reflect, and follow them, because they will help you find your passions. They will help you find the kaupapa or your purpose in life as well. And just hearing Matua Rereata there, that sounds like the most beautiful kaupapa to be involved in, is around that curriculum for our tamariki, so that they can have those career pathways in the taiao. So nā rats mihi ki a koe I te rangatira mō tōna kōrero.
Tēnā koe tuahine. O tira, e tō ai te anō I ngā mihi ki a koe papa, e te whakatupuranga e haumaru tonu ai mātau e haere ake nei. Mātau te tuahine nei noho nei ki o reke reke. Nā reira tēnā koe o tira e te tuahine e te rangatira I roto I tō ao e mahi nei ngā mahi hai oranga tonutanga mo tō tāu aiwi o Ngāti Hine o tira te iwi whānui tēnā koe te tuahine. Korua tahi, kua rangatira mātau e whakarongo nei ki a kōrua ki ngā tini kōrero I puta, te huhua, te whānui, te rētōtanga, he a tāhua. Thank you so much for being with us here today and giving of your time, your energy and your love for all of the kaupapa that you're partaking of, but also kei te hiki. Nā reira, e kore e mutu ngā mihi kia kōrua e tēnei taumata, hei tīmatanga mō tātou I tēnei te Toi Tangata Hui atau 2022. Tēnā kōrua. Kia ora. O tira ka huri ngā mihi kia koutou katoa I te iwi, kua ki a roto, kua ki a roto ki tēnei enei mea te kōrero, te kai, te mātauranga, te kai. Hoino, kua tai ki te wā e ki hoki ai te puku. Nā reira, we'll have a bit of a break e te whānau for lunch. But just before that, yeah, just want to reiterate all the mihi to our kaikōrero this morning and the beautiful kōrero that we've had. Mihi to all the whānau have connected in and shared whakapapa and play stories too in our Slack channel. Ooh, getting a bit flash, nei? I te tuaroatanga mai o tēnei hui ātou. But if you've resonated with any of our peeps in the Hui ātou channel, feel free to use the DM, the direct messaging tool to connect more. Seeing as we're in this virtual space. Also, big mahi to our League of Live illustrators who have come back again to jam with us. You would have seen some of their illustrations from our last Hui Ātou, amazing. So really, really looking forward to seeing the different things that come out of this hui and all the kōrero kei te haere. So they'll be with us for the duration of the Toi Tangata Hui Ātou, and you might see them in some of the workshops as well. After Kai, we'll be coming back. We'll be coming back at around, yeah, workshop links will be open to participants, everybody to come in at around 12:30, and then 12:45 will get stuck in. But for those workshops, if you haven't already had a look at the material workshop, hoi tū te rangi, that Zoom link, that whare, introducing our day one workshop kaikōrero, Dr. Wai Ngata of Tapu Waikura. Oh, he haramai. Wayne is a descendant of the Ngāti Ira tribe of Manga Tuna tai Rāwhiti Aotearoa. He is a long-time advocate and supporter of Maori language revitalization, Maori medium education, Maori art development, and traditional chant and performance. Wayne is actively engaged in providing advice on Maori education and Maori language development at national and ministerial levels. He has also a keen interest and involvement with wakahaurua renaissance and rebuilding environmental bodies of knowledge, Maori knowledge. The workshop that we'll have in Otamarako with Ngai o Tiuka, human health is not a priority, hei ko tāna. Working for the iwi has highlighted numerous issues with the management of the environment, including how tangata whenua rights and responsibilities have been treated or largely ignored. The cultural relationship tangata whenua has had with the environment has been eroded, streams treated like drains, springs and waterways run dry, and water abstraction holds primacy. Despite best efforts and environmental court successes, Havelock North was still the center of the biggest gastro outbreak in our recorded history. Our national history, and groundwater abstraction continues to increase beyond sustainable environmental and cultural limits. This demonstrates how humans' health and well-being is not a priority in water and environmental policy, and the examples of it are numerous.